When you first encounter Yoda in the swamps of Dagobah, when you see this small, ancient creature hobbling through the mist with his Geimer stick, speaking in riddles and testing the patience of those who seek him, you might wonder how this being could possibly be the legendary Jedi Master that stories have whispered about across the galaxy. He stands barely 2 feet tall, his green skin wrinkled with the passage of centuries, his movements slow and deliberate. But then you witness what he can do. You watch as he lifts objects that should be immovable, as he deflects attacks that should be unstoppable, as he speaks wisdom that penetrates to the very core of what it means to be connected to the Force. And you understand. Size matters not. This diminutive being, this ancient master whose species has never been named, whose homeworld remains a mystery even to those who knew him best, is one of the most powerful Force users who ever lived. This is Yoda, Grand Master of the Jedi Order, teacher to generations of Jedi Knights, warrior, philosopher, strategist, and guide. For over 8 centuries, he shaped the destiny of the Jedi, trained thousands of students, fought in countless conflicts, witnessed the rise and fall of governments, and ultimately became the bridge between the old order and the new. His life spanned nearly the entire recorded history of the modern Jedi, beginning in an era of peace and ending in an age of darkness and renewal. To understand Yoda is to understand the Force itself, to grasp how power and wisdom can exist in the most unlikely of forms, to recognize that the greatest teachers are often those who have lived long enough to witness both triumph and catastrophe, success and failure, light and darkness in all their manifestations. The story begins almost 900 years before the Battle of Endor, in an era when the galaxy was vastly different from what it would become. Yoda was born in 896 before the Battle of Yavin, though the exact location of his birth remains one of the great mysteries of the Star Wars universe. His species has no official name in any canon or legends material. His homeworld has never been identified. George Lucas deliberately kept these details secret, believing that Yoda should remain mysterious, that not everything needed explanation, that some characters gained power through what remained unknown about them. This secrecy has been maintained throughout decades of Star Wars storytelling, creating a figure who exists partially in shadow, whose origins are as enigmatic as the Force he serves. What we do know is that Yoda's species is incredibly long-lived, with lifespans extending to at least 900 years. The infancy and childhood of this species is extended accordingly. Grogu, another member of Yoda's species who appears in The Mandalorian, is 50 years old, but still possesses the development level of a human toddler. This suggests that Yoda's childhood would have lasted decades, his adolescence perhaps a century, his maturity coming only after more time than most species exist as civilizations. The implications are profound. Yoda experienced time differently than almost any being in the galaxy. Events that seemed urgent to shorter-lived species were merely moments in his extended existence. Trends that appeared permanent to humans were temporary fluctuations in the flow of history he witnessed. Yoda's discovery by the Jedi Order occurred when he was still young by his species' standards, though the exact circumstances remain clouded. In Legends material, which is no longer considered official canon but provides interesting context, Yoda and a Force-sensitive friend were discovered on a remote world by a Jedi Master named Encata del Gormo. This mysterious Jedi, a Hysalrian who resembled a small dinosaur, trained both younglings in the ways of the Force in a harsh wilderness environment, teaching them to survive and to channel their abilities before a Republic ship eventually arrived to bring them to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. In current canon, Encata del Gormo has been referenced in Mace Windu's novel as potentially being one of Yoda's mentors, though even Mace wasn't certain of the details, highlighting how little even senior Jedi knew about Yoda's early training. What's confirmed in canon is that by 100 years of age, Yoda had achieved the rank of Jedi Master, an extraordinary accomplishment that typically took decades even for the most talented students. This means that Yoda spent his first century training, learning, mastering the Force and lightsaber combat to a degree that earned recognition from the Jedi Council. From that point forward, from 796, before the Battle of Yavin until his death at 900 years old, Yoda trained Jedi. 800 years of teaching. Thousands upon thousands of students passed through his instruction. Some estimates suggest Yoda personally trained or influenced approximately 20,000 Jedi during his tenure, though the exact number is impossible to verify given the sheer span of time involved. The Jedi Order Yoda joined was ancient itself, having existed for tens of thousands of years by the time of his birth. But Yoda's longevity meant he would witness more of the Order's history than perhaps anyone besides the longest-lived of their members. He saw the High Republic era, a golden age when the Jedi and the Republic worked in harmony to bring peace and prosperity to the galaxy. He witnessed conflicts with dark side cults like the Path of the Open Hand, who created biological weapons called the Nameless that fed on Force-sensitive beings, causing them to experience their worst fears before dying or being turned to stone. Yoda helped end the battle against the Path, an event known as the Night of Sorrow, and he made the controversial decision to hide the knowledge of the Nameless from the Jedi archives, keeping these living weapons secret to protect the Order. During the High Republic period, Yoda also took a sabbatical from the Jedi High Council, something almost unheard of for a Grand Master. He traveled aboard a vessel called the Star Hopper, training Padawans directly and leading missions against the Nihil, a vicious pirate organization that terrorized the Outer Rim. The Nihil were more than simple criminals. They possessed technology that allowed them to navigate hyperspace using dangerous, unpredictable routes that other ships couldn't follow, making them nearly impossible to track or engage. They attacked civilian targets, destroyed infrastructure, and spread chaos across multiple systems. Yoda's direct involvement in fighting them demonstrated his commitment not just to philosophical teaching, but to active protection of innocence. One of the most dramatic events of this period was the fall of Starlight Beacon, a massive space station that served as a symbol of Republic and Jedi presence in the frontier regions. When the Nihil attacked, causing catastrophic damage and the station's eventual destruction, Yoda was involved in rescue operations and combat on multiple fronts. On Corellia, as Nihil forces attempted to steal ships from the planet's famous shipyards, Yoda demonstrated his extraordinary power. Young Jedi and civilians were struggling to prevent a massive trawler from being stolen, using the Force to hold it back, but losing their grip as Nihil reinforcements arrived. Then Yoda appeared, cloaked and hooded, and suddenly the trawler became weightless. He held the enormous ship effortlessly with the Force, demonstrating a level of telekinetic power that astonished even experienced Jedi. The Nihil war cloud dissipated, the pirates were defeated, and Starlight's survivors were saved. But the incident showed something crucial about Yoda. His power was not theoretical or ceremonial. When needed, when lives were at stake, he could channel the Force with devastating effectiveness. Yoda's lightsaber skills were equally impressive. His small size might suggest disadvantage in combat, but he turned it into an asset. Yoda practiced Form 4, Ataru, the most acrobatic of the 7 primary lightsaber combat forms. Ataru emphasized spinning, jumping, and rapid strikes from unexpected angles, using the Force to augment physical movements beyond normal capabilities. For Yoda, this meant becoming a blur in combat, flipping and spinning faster than opponents could track, attacking from above, below, and all sides in rapid succession. His fighting style was aggressive, energetic, overwhelming. Opponents trained to fight human-sized duelists found themselves completely unprepared for someone who could leap over their heads, strike at their legs, and spin through spaces they thought were too small to matter. But Yoda was not merely a warrior, and he never glorified combat. One of his defining characteristics was his reluctance to fight, his belief that violence should be a last resort, that the Jedi's primary purpose was peacekeeping rather than warfare. He taught generations of students that a Jedi uses the Force for knowledge and defense, never for attack. This philosophy would be tested severely during the Clone Wars, but throughout most of his life, Yoda embodied the ideal of the peaceful warrior, someone capable of devastating force but choosing wisdom, negotiation, and understanding first. The contradiction between his abilities and his reluctance to use them defined much of his character. Yoda's teaching methods were equally distinctive. He believed in learning through experience, through failure, through students discovering truths for themselves rather than having knowledge simply handed to them. When he trained younglings, the youngest students in the Jedi Temple, he would present them with challenges and puzzles, encouraging them to think creatively about the Force and its applications. He famously instructed groups of children in the basics of lightsaber combat, teaching them the initial forms and techniques that would be refined over years of additional training. These teaching sessions were patient, gentle, filled with encouragement and wisdom. Yoda understood that children learned differently than adults, that they needed support and guidance rather than harsh criticism. But Yoda also took personal Padawans, students who trained directly under him in the traditional master-apprentice relationship that defined Jedi education. One of his most significant students was Count Dooku, chosen to be Yoda's Padawan in 86 before the Battle of Yavin. Dooku was a human from the wealthy world of Sereno, intelligent, skilled, and ambitious. Yoda recognized his potential and took it upon himself to refine it, a rare choice for a Grand Master who typically focused on broader teaching rather than individual students. The training was intensive. Dooku learned not just combat and force techniques, but philosophy, history, diplomacy, everything a Jedi needed to serve the Republic effectively. The relationship between Yoda and Dooku was complex. The student respected his master, but also questioned the Jedi Order's direction, particularly their close ties to the Republic's government. Dooku believed the Republic was becoming corrupt, that politicians prioritized their own power over justice, that the Jedi were becoming complacent enablers of this corruption rather than true guardians of peace. Yoda tried to address these concerns, tried to show Dooku that the Jedi worked within imperfect systems because perfect systems didn't exist, that compromise and patience were necessary for long-term positive change. But Dooku grew increasingly disillusioned, his idealism curdling into cynicism, his frustration transforming into anger. Eventually, Dooku left the Jedi Order. He returned to Sereno to claim his family's title and wealth, becoming Count Dooku, a political figure rather than a Jedi. Yoda felt the loss, deeply, viewing it as a personal failure. He'd trained Dooku, shaped him, believed in him, and yet his student had rejected the Order's teachings. What Yoda didn't know at the time was that Dooku had found a new master, Darth Sidious, and had turned to the dark side, becoming the Sith Lord Darth Tyrannus. This betrayal would have devastating consequences decades later, setting in motion the Clone Wars that would destroy the Jedi Order and transform the Republic into the Empire. Over the centuries, Yoda also trained other significant Jedi. While many of his students' names are lost to history, we know he influenced virtually every Jedi who came through the temple during his tenure. Obi-Wan Kenobi, Mace Windu, Ki-Adi-Mundi, and countless others learned from Yoda at some point in their education. Even Jedi who had different primary masters still attended Yoda's classes, still learned from his wisdom, still carried his teachings with them throughout their careers. This meant that when the Clone Wars began and the Jedi were thrust into military leadership, they were guided by principles Yoda had instilled. The emphasis on defense, on protecting others, on using power responsibly, all came from his centuries of teaching. Yoda's position on the Jedi High Council gave him significant influence over the Order's direction. As Grand Master, he was the most senior member, the final authority on many decisions, the voice that carried the most weight in debates about policy and philosophy. But Yoda didn't rule as a dictator. He listened to other council members, valued their perspectives, sought consensus rather than imposing his will. The council operated through discussion and collective wisdom, with Yoda guiding rather than commanding. This approach had strengths and weaknesses. It allowed diverse viewpoints to shape Jedi policy, preventing any single individual's biases from dominating. But it also made the Order slower to respond to threats, more hesitant to take decisive action when situations demanded urgency. As the Republic entered its final decades, as the Sith machinations that would destroy everything Yoda had built began accelerating, warning signs appeared that the Council failed to properly interpret. Yoda himself sensed disturbances in the Force, felt that something was wrong, but couldn't identify the specific threat. The dark side was clouding the Jedi's perception, making it difficult to see clearly, to predict what was coming. This limitation frustrated Yoda, who'd always relied on his Force senses to guide him. He felt the danger but couldn't name it, couldn't point to it, couldn't develop an effective response because the threat remained hidden in shadows. The invasion of Naboo in 32. Before the Battle of Yavin marked the beginning of the end, though none of them understood it at the time. When Qui-Gon Jinn returned from Naboo with reports of a dark warrior who'd attacked him with a lightsaber and knowledge of the Force, Yoda knew immediately what it meant. The Sith had returned. After a millennium in hiding, after generations where the Jedi believed their ancient enemies were extinct, the Sith were back. Qui-Gon had been attacked by Darth Maul, though they didn't know his name yet, and that meant the rule of two was in effect. Always two there are, Yoda explained. A master and an apprentice. No more, no less. If Darth Maul existed, so did another Sith, hidden somewhere, manipulating events from the shadows. Qui-Gon also brought Anakin Skywalker before the Council. A 9-year-old boy he claimed was the chosen one prophesied to bring balance to the Force. Yoda tested Anakin, probing his feelings, his fears, his connection to the Force. What he found troubled him deeply. The boy was extraordinarily powerful, with a midi-chlorian count higher than even Yoda's own, suggesting a connection to the Force stronger than any Jedi had encountered. But Anakin was also filled with fear. Fear of loss, fear for his mother who remained enslaved on Tatooine, fear of the unknown future before him. Fear is the path to the dark side, Yoda warned. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. Anakin was too old to begin training, his attachments already formed, his emotions already complex and difficult. The Council refused Qui-Gon's request to train him. After Qui-Gon's death at Darth Maul's hands during the Battle of Naboo, the Council reversed their decision. Qui-Gon's dying wish had been for Obi-Wan to train Anakin, and despite Yoda's continued objections, the Council agreed. Obi-Wan was elevated to Jedi Knight and granted permission to take Anakin as his Padawan. Yoda accepted this decision, but his misgivings never disappeared. He'd sensed grave danger in Anakin's training, had felt that the boy's presence was connected to darkness in ways he couldn't articulate. Events would prove him tragically correct, though even Yoda couldn't have predicted the full extent of the catastrophe that training Anakin Skywalker would unleash. The period between the invasion of Naboo and the Clone Wars saw increasing tensions across the galaxy. The Separatist movement, led publicly by Count Dooku, but secretly orchestrated by Darth Sidious, grew in strength. Thousands of systems began leaving the Republic, claiming the central government was corrupt and ineffective, demanding independence or radical reform. The Jedi found themselves stretched thin, trying to mediate disputes, prevent violence, maintain peace in a galaxy careening toward war. Yoda coordinated many of these efforts, dispatching Jedi to hotspots, advising the Senate on crisis management, attempting to prevent the fractures from becoming irreparable. One particularly telling incident occurred when Obi-Wan Kenobi came to Yoda with a puzzle. A planet called Kamino had been erased from the Jedi archives, deleted from star charts and records as though it never existed. Someone with access to the temple's most secure systems had deliberately removed this information. Yoda was deeply troubled by this revelation. The archives were supposed to be inviolate, containing all knowledge the Jedi had accumulated over millennia. The idea that someone could alter them, could hide entire worlds from Jedi awareness, suggested infiltration at the highest levels. But who? And why? The answer came when Obi-Wan traveled to Kamino and discovered a massive clone army being created for the Republic. The Kaminoans, masters of cloning technology, claimed the army had been commissioned by the Jedi Council a decade earlier, paid for by a Jedi Master named Sifo Dyas, who'd mysteriously disappeared. But Yoda and the Council had never authorized such an army. Sifo Dyas had acted alone, foreseeing a conflict the Council didn't believe would occur, commissioning the clones without permission. Then he'd been killed, his mission hijacked by the Sith, the clone army transformed into an instrument of the Jedi's eventual destruction, even as it appeared to be their greatest asset. The Battle of Geonosis forced the Jedi's hand. Separatist forces were building a droid army, were preparing for war, and had captured Obi-Wan Kenobi, Anakin Skywalker, and Senator Padme Amidala for execution. Yoda made a fateful decision. He led the clone army to Geonosis, using the troops to rescue the captured Jedi and attack the Separatist leadership. The battle was intense, chaotic, with Jedi fighting alongside clones against seemingly endless waves of battle droids. Yoda himself engaged in combat, demonstrating his fighting prowess as he cut through droids and defended clone positions. The climax came when Yoda confronted Count Dooku, his former Padawan now revealed as a Sith Lord. The duel between them was extraordinary. Dooku was a master of Form 2, Makashi, the dueling form designed specifically for lightsaber versus lightsaber combat. His technique was precise, economical, elegant. He'd already defeated Obi-Wan and Anakin, severing Anakin's arm and nearly killing both of them. But against Yoda, Dooku's advantages disappeared. The ancient Jedi Master moved with blinding speed, flipping and spinning, his green blade a blur as he attacked from every angle. Dooku defended desperately, his superior size and reach meaningless against someone who fought in 3 dimensions, who could leap over attacks and strike from mid-air. Yoda pressed the offensive, stating that Dooku had fought well, but that the battle was essentially over. Dooku recognized he couldn't win through direct combat. Instead, he used the Force to cause a massive pillar to fall towards the injured Obi-Wan and Anakin. Yoda immediately shifted from offense to defense, catching the pillar with the Force, holding the enormous weight suspended to protect the younger Jedi. In that moment of distraction, Dooku escaped in his solar sailor, fleeing Geonosis. Yoda let him go, prioritizing saving lives over capturing his former student. The moment symbolized the fundamental difference between Jedi and Sith. Yoda could have let the pillar fall and pursued Dooku, possibly killing or capturing him and ending the Separatist leadership. But he chose to save lives, accepting Dooku's escape as the price of protecting innocence. A Sith would have made the opposite choice without hesitation. The Clone Wars had begun, and Yoda found himself thrust into a role he'd never wanted: military general. The Republic had no standing army before the clones appeared, relying instead on planetary defense forces and a small judicial force. Now they were fighting a galaxy-spanning war against the Separatists, and the Jedi, supposed peacekeepers, became warriors. Yoda led clone legions into battle, coordinated campaigns, made strategic decisions that determined whether systems lived or died. He was extraordinarily effective at it, his centuries of experience and deep understanding of tactics making him one of the Republic's most successful commanders. But he hated every moment, hated that the Jedi had been forced into this position, hated the casualties and the violence and the darkness that war brought. During the Clone Wars, Yoda participated in numerous significant battles. On the planet Rugosa, he defended King Katunko of Toydaria from separatist forces, demonstrating his combat abilities in spectacular fashion. Separatist commander Asajj Ventress, a dark side assassin working for Count Dooku, sent an entire droid battalion to kill Yoda and convince the king that the Republic couldn't protect him. Yoda, accompanied only by 3 clone troopers, faced the droids directly. He used guerrilla tactics, clever positioning, and devastating force abilities to destroy the battalion. At one point, he used force stasis to freeze Ventress herself in place, demonstrating his ability to overpower even skilled dark side users. The display convinced King Katunko to ally Toydaria with the Republic, though the victory felt hollow given the manipulation and violence required to achieve it. Yoda also led clone forces during the Battle of Kashyyyk, fighting to protect the Wookiee homeworld from separatist invasion. The Wookiees were fierce warriors, and their planet was strategically important, making it a key battleground in the war's final stages. Yoda commanded both Jedi and clones, coordinating with Wookiee chieftains, directing the defense from locations throughout the massive tree cities that covered Kashyyyk. The battle was going well, the separatist forces being pushed back, victory seeming possible. Then Order 66 was executed, and everything changed. Order 66 was a contingency protocol embedded in the clones from their creation on Kamino. It designated all Jedi as traitors to the Republic and commanded the clones to execute them immediately. Darth Sidious, revealed as Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, had been manipulating events throughout the entire war, using his position to consolidate power and positioning himself to destroy the Jedi at the perfect moment. When he activated Order 66, clone troopers across the galaxy turned on their Jedi commanders, shooting them in the back, overwhelming them through sheer numbers, executing the warriors who'd led them and trusted them throughout years of combat. On Kashyyyk, Yoda sensed the deaths. His connection to the Force was so strong, so refined, that he could feel individual Jedi dying throughout the galaxy, could identify them through their final moments. The pain was overwhelming. Students he'd trained, colleagues he'd worked with for centuries, younglings who'd barely begun their education, all dying, all being murdered by the very soldiers they'd fought beside. Yoda felt the death of Mace Windu, the destruction of Jedi at the temple on Coruscant, the systematic extermination of his entire order. Before the clone troopers with him could execute their own orders, Yoda struck first. He used the Force to sense the clones' intentions, detected their betrayal microseconds before they acted, and defended himself. The clones accompanying him were killed, but Yoda survived, aided by Wookiee warriors who helped him escape. Yoda returned to Coruscant with Senator Bail Organa and Obi-Wan Kenobi, who'd also survived Order 66. They found the Jedi Temple burning, filled with clone troopers and the bodies of dead Jedi. The slaughter had been comprehensive. Younglings, Padawans, Knights, Masters, all murdered. The security recordings showed Anakin Skywalker, now Darth Vader, leading the attack, cutting down children who looked at him with trust and confusion. Yoda watched the recordings with growing horror, understanding that his concerns about training Anakin had been justified, but that the realization came far too late to matter. The prophecy of the Chosen One bringing balance to the Force had come true, but not in any way the Jedi had expected. Anakin brought balance by destroying the Jedi, eliminating thousands of light side users and leaving only 2 Sith, creating a brutal mathematical equilibrium through genocide. Yoda made a devastating decision. He would confront Darth Sidious directly, attempt to kill the Sith Lord, and perhaps prevent the complete triumph of the dark side. Obi-Wan would go after Vader, try to stop or kill his former Padawan. The plan was desperate, born from the understanding that the Jedi Order was finished, that the Republic they'd served had become the Empire, that everything they'd built over millennia was ash. But perhaps they could still strike one blow against the darkness, could eliminate the architects of their destruction even if they couldn't save what had been lost. Yoda's infiltration of the Galactic Senate building demonstrated his abilities at stealth and combat. He killed the 2 Imperial Royal Guards protecting Darth Sidious's office, cutting them down with precise strikes before they could sound an alarm. Then he confronted Sidious himself. Emperor was initially amused, believing he could easily defeat the ancient Jedi. That confidence evaporated quickly. Yoda proved to be Sidious's equal in raw Force power, possibly even his superior. When Sidious unleashed Force lightning, one of the Sith's most devastating weapons, Yoda caught it with his bare hands, absorbed the energy, and redirected it back at Sidious, creating a massive Force shockwave that blasted both of them apart. The duel continued through the Senate chamber. Sidious hurled Senate pods at Yoda, using telekinesis to weaponize the large hovering platforms. Yoda dodged and blocked, sending pods back at Sidious, the 2 Force users battling with both lightsabers and the Force simultaneously. The combat was extraordinarily destructive, tearing apart the chamber, creating chaos as Senate pods crashed and exploded. Yoda matched Sidious strike for strike, blast for blast, demonstrating that even in lightsaber combat, despite his age and small size, he could fight the most powerful Sith Lord in generations on equal terms. But Sidious had an advantage Yoda didn't. The Sith had spent decades preparing for this confrontation. Sidious had shaped the galaxy to serve his purposes, had armies and political structures backing him, had transformed the Republic into the Empire with himself as absolute ruler. Yoda was alone, exhausted, fighting with the weight of the Order's extinction on his shoulders. During a particularly intense exchange of Force lightning, Yoda lost his grip on the Senate pod he was standing on and fell, plummeting into the depths of the chamber. He survived the fall, aided by the Force and by Senator Organa, who helped him escape. But the duel was over. Yoda had failed to kill Sidious. The Sith had won. Yoda went into exile on Dagobah, a remote swamp planet strong in the Force. The choice was deliberate. Dagobah's dark side cave and general Force saturation created interference, making it difficult for Sidious or Vader to sense Yoda's presence, even if they searched for him. The planet was hostile, filled with dangerous creatures and oppressive humidity, but it was also isolated, forgotten, perfect for someone who needed to disappear while contemplating the catastrophic failures that had destroyed everything he'd dedicated his life to building. Yoda spent 19 years on Dagobah, living in a small hut, surviving on what the swamp provided, meditating on the Force and on his mistakes. During this exile, Yoda came to understand things about the Force that he'd never grasped during his centuries of service. He'd believed the Jedi understood the Force completely, that their teachings were complete and correct, that the dark side was simply evil to be opposed rather than a reflection of the Force's true complexity. Now, stripped of his position and power, Yoda realized the Jedi's arrogance had contributed to their destruction. They'd become complacent, dogmatic, so certain of their righteousness that they couldn't see their own blindness. They'd bound themselves to a corrupt republic, had taken on roles as warriors when their purpose was peacekeeping, had failed to recognize the Sith Lord operating in their midst for decades. Yoda learned from the Force spirit of Qui-Gon Jinn, who'd discovered how to maintain consciousness after death, becoming one with the Force, yet retaining individual identity. This was a technique the Jedi had forgotten or never known, a light side ability that allowed transcendence beyond physical death. Qui-Gon taught Yoda, and Yoda in turn learned to communicate with the Force priestesses, mysterious beings who existed in a realm between the living Force and the cosmic Force. Through them, Yoda came to understand that the Force was not simply a tool to be used, but a living energy that existed in partnership with those connected to it. That balance came not from eliminating darkness, but from understanding both light and dark, from choosing light while acknowledging darkness's existence. Years passed. The Empire consolidated its power. The Jedi became myths, stories told to frighten children or dismissed as religious nonsense by those who'd never witnessed the Force in action. Yoda waited, sensing through the Force that eventually someone would come. The Force had a will, and that will wouldn't allow the Jedi to remain extinct forever. Someday a student would arrive, someone who could be trained, who could carry the Jedi tradition forward into whatever future the Force intended. That student was Luke Skywalker, son of Anakin, inheritor of extraordinary Force potential, guided to Dagobah by Obi-Wan's Force spirit. Luke crashed his X-wing into the swamp and encountered a peculiar creature who claimed to know the Jedi Master he sought. Yoda tested Luke thoroughly before revealing himself, trying to understand the young man's character, his patience, his willingness to learn. What he found was frustrating but also familiar. Luke was impatient, reckless, angry, full of desire for adventure and heroism. He was, in many ways, like his father. But he also possessed compassion, loyalty, determination to help his friends. These qualities gave Yoda hope, though he remained reluctant to train someone who reminded him so much of his greatest failure. Obi-Wan's Force spirit convinced Yoda to accept Luke as a student, despite the risks. Luke's training on Dagobah was intensive, challenging, designed to break through his preconceptions about power and teach him the true nature of the Force. Yoda made Luke run through the swamp carrying him on his back, perform acrobatic exercises, meditate while maintaining difficult physical positions. The training wasn't about building strength or improving combat skills. It was about teaching Luke to trust the Force, to let go of his doubts and fears, to understand that the Force wasn't a tool to be wielded, but a partner to work alongside. The most famous lesson came when Luke's X-wing sank deeper into the swamp. Luke tried to lift it using the Force, but gave up after minimal effort, claiming it was too big, too heavy, impossible. Yoda sighed with disappointment. "Size matters not," he explained. "Judge me by my size, do you? The Force flows through all things, binds everything together. There is no difference between lifting a rock and lifting a starship except the limitations in your own mind." Luke didn't believe him, so Yoda demonstrated. The ancient Jedi Master closed his eyes, stretched out his hand, and lifted the entire X-wing out of the swamp, through the Force alone. He moved it through the air with perfect control, setting it gently on dry land, proving that what seemed impossible was merely difficult, that the Force had no inherent limitations beyond those Force users imposed through doubt and fear. Luke's response was telling. He claimed he didn't believe it, though he was staring directly at evidence proving otherwise. His disbelief wasn't about what he saw, but about accepting his own potential, acknowledging that he could do similar things if he truly committed to trusting the Force. "That was why you failed," Yoda said simply. "Belief, commitment, trust. These were the foundations of Force use, more important than technique or natural talent or years of training. Without them, even the strongest Force-sensitive would accomplish nothing. With them, students like Luke could grow into true Jedi despite inauspicious beginnings." The training was interrupted when Luke experienced a vision of his friends in pain, captured by Darth Vader, suffering. He immediately wanted to abandon his training and rush to rescue them. Yoda and Obi-Wan warned him it was a trap, that Vader was using his friends as bait to lure Luke into confrontation before he was ready, that leaving would likely result in Luke's death or fall to the dark side. Luke didn't listen. He left Dagobah, promising to return, flying toward Cloud City and the destiny waiting there. Yoda watched him go with resignation. The boy had potential, yes, but also his father's recklessness, his inability to put duty before personal attachment. Yoda told Obi-Wan that there was another Skywalker, Leia, suggesting that if Luke failed, perhaps she could be trained instead. But he also sensed that Luke would not fail completely, that the student would survive and eventually return to complete his education. Luke did return after his confrontation with Vader, after learning his father's identity, after surviving the trauma of Cloud City and the loss of his hand. But by then, Yoda was dying. 900 years was a long life even for his species, and the exile, the stress, the weight of the Order's extinction had taken their toll. Yoda was bedridden, weak, his body failing as Luke entered his hut. The ancient Jedi Master used his remaining strength to teach final lessons. He confirmed that Vader was indeed Luke's father. He warned Luke not to underestimate the Emperor, that Palpatine was even more dangerous than Vader, that facing him would be the ultimate test. And then Yoda revealed something Luke hadn't known. There was another Skywalker. Leia was Luke's twin sister, also strong in the Force, also capable of carrying the Jedi legacy forward if Luke failed. Yoda's final words were about passing on what he had learned. "When gone am I, the last of the Jedi will you be, the burden you must bear. Always pass on what you have learned." With those words, Yoda died, his body becoming one with the Force, disappearing as his spirit transcended physical existence. He'd achieved what Qui-Gon had taught him, what few Jedi throughout history had managed. His consciousness remained intact, his identity preserved, his wisdom available to guide future generations even from beyond death. Yoda became a Force ghost, appearing to Luke alongside Obi-Wan and eventually Anakin, visible proof that the light side offered something the dark side couldn't match, true immortality through selfless connection to the Force. The legacy Yoda left behind was complex and multi-layered. On one level, he'd failed catastrophically. The Jedi Order he'd led for centuries was destroyed. The Republic he'd served had become the tyrannical empire. His most promising student had become the galaxy's greatest villain. The Sith he'd believed extinct had orchestrated everything, playing him and the entire Jedi Council like instruments, manipulating them into positions where their destruction became inevitable. Yoda had lived for 900 years, accumulated wisdom beyond measure, wielded power few could match, and yet he'd been unable to prevent any of it. The humiliation was profound, the failure absolute. But on another level, Yoda had succeeded in the most important ways. He'd preserved the knowledge and philosophy of the Jedi, passing it to Luke when no one else remained who could. He'd learned from his mistakes during his exile, understanding the Order's arrogance and dogmatism in ways he couldn't have while immersed in its structures. He'd recognized that attachment, the emotion the Jedi feared most, could also be a source of strength when balanced properly with duty and wisdom. His teachings to Luke were different from what he'd taught previous students, refined by failure, improved through suffering, made more flexible and human by the understanding that absolute rules often created the problems they intended to prevent. Yoda's influence on Luke was transformative and lasting. Everything Luke accomplished as a Jedi came from foundations Yoda established. The faith Luke showed in Vader, the belief that his father could be redeemed, came partly from Yoda's teachings about the Force's nature, about how the light side was always stronger than darkness in the long term. The control Luke demonstrated when facing the Emperor, the ability to reject the dark side even when tortured, reflected Yoda's lessons about emotional discipline and trusting the Force. Luke's eventual establishment of a new Jedi Order was built on principles Yoda had taught him, adapted and modified based on Luke's own experiences and Yoda's warnings about the old Order's failures. The specific fighting techniques Yoda developed continued influencing Jedi combat training for generations. His lightsaber form, Ataru, remained a template for how smaller Force users could compete with larger opponents. His integration of Force abilities directly into combat sequences, using telekinesis mid-duel and employing acrobatics impossible without Force augmentation, became standard practice for Jedi who studied his methods. Recordings of Yoda's battles, preserved in various archives, were analyzed by Force scholars trying to understand how someone so small could be so devastatingly effective. The answer was always the same: complete trust in the Force, absolute commitment to technique, and centuries of practice that had refined every movement to perfection. Yoda's philosophy extended far beyond combat, however. His teachings about the nature of the Force shaped Jedi understanding for generations. The distinction he drew between the living Force, the energy generated by living beings in the present moment, and the cosmic Force, the binding energy that connected all things across time and space, helped students understand how their individual actions related to larger patterns. Yoda taught that Jedi should live in the present, focus on what they could affect now, rather than becoming lost in concerns about past or future. Yet he also emphasized that present actions had consequences rippling forward through time, that every choice mattered in ways that might not be immediately apparent. His perspective on prophecy was particularly nuanced. Yoda believed prophecies could reveal potential futures, could show paths the Force itself preferred. But he also understood that prophecy wasn't destiny, that the future remained in motion, shaped by choices yet to be made. The prophecy of the Chosen One had dominated much of his later life, influencing decisions about Anakin's training, creating expectations that ultimately went unfulfilled in any straightforward way. Yoda came to understand that prophecies were guides rather than guarantees, that trying to force their fulfillment often prevented it, that the best approach was to act with wisdom and trust the Force to work through events in ways mortals couldn't always predict or control. The question of whether Yoda should have done things differently, whether different choices could have prevented the Jedi's extinction, haunted him during his exile and continues being debated by historians. Should he have refused to train Anakin more forcefully, overruling Qui-Gon's dying wish? Should he have recognized Palpatine as Sidious earlier, detected the Sith Lord operating in plain sight for decades? Should he have prevented the Jedi from becoming military generals during the Clone Wars, maintaining their role as peacekeepers even if it meant refusing to defend the Republic? Each question has arguments on multiple sides, reflecting the complexity of the situations Yoda faced. What's undeniable is that Yoda did recognize many of the problems confronting the Jedi, did try to address them, but was constrained by institutional momentum and his own limitations. He understood the Jedi were becoming too involved in politics, but extricating the Order from centuries of close cooperation with the Republic was impossible in the short term. He sensed the dark side clouding their vision, but couldn't identify the specific source or develop effective countermeasures. He worried about Anakin's training, but felt bound by Qui-Gon's final request and the Council's collective decision. Yoda was wise, powerful, experienced, but he wasn't omniscient or omnipotent. He made the best decisions he could with the information available, and those decisions proved insufficient to prevent catastrophe. One of Yoda's most significant character traits was his humility despite his position and power. He never claimed to have all answers, never suggested his wisdom was perfect or complete. When students asked questions he couldn't answer, he admitted his uncertainty rather than inventing explanations. When his predictions proved wrong, he acknowledged the errors and adjusted his understanding. This intellectual honesty made him a better teacher than more arrogant masters who couldn't admit mistakes. Students learned from Yoda that wisdom included recognizing the limits of one's knowledge, that uncertainty was acceptable as long as you remained committed to learning and growing. His sense of humor was another defining characteristic, often overlooked because of his serious demeanor and grave responsibilities. Yoda enjoyed pranks, wordplay, and gentle teasing of students and colleagues. His distinctive speech pattern, placing verbs at the end of sentences and restructuring grammar in ways that sounded archaic or alien, was partly linguistic quirk, but also partly deliberate choice. The unusual phrasing forced listeners to pay closer attention, to think about what he was saying rather than hearing words passively. It made his teachings more memorable, created a distinctive voice that students would recall years later when facing difficult decisions. Yoda's relationship with other Jedi Council members revealed his collaborative leadership style. He worked closely with Mace Windu, respecting the younger Master's combat prowess and tactical thinking even when they disagreed on policy. He valued Ki-Adi-Mundi's perspective on matters related to the Outer Rim and unusual situations like Ki-Adi-Mundi's authorized family, despite Jedi prohibitions on attachment. He listened to Plo Koon's concerns about clone trooper welfare, to Shark T's observations about clone training on Kamino, to Adigalia's intelligence reports about separatist activities. The Council functioned best when all members contributed their unique perspectives, and Yoda facilitated that collaboration rather than dominating discussions. But Yoda could also be stern and unyielding when necessary. He had no patience for arrogance, for students who believed power made them superior to others. When Anakin displayed such attitudes, Yoda rebuked him sharply, trying to instill humility and proper understanding of the Jedi's role. When Council members pushed for actions Yoda believed violated Jedi principles, he argued forcefully against them, using his authority to prevent decisions he considered wrong. The combination of humility in learning and firmness in principles made Yoda an effective leader, someone who could change his mind when presented with new information, but who wouldn't compromise on fundamental values. Yoda's connection to nature and the living force was evident throughout his life, but became especially prominent during his exile on Dagobah. He lived in harmony with the swamp, taking only what he needed, disturbing the ecosystem minimally. He understood that the Force flowed through all living things, that the smallest creatures contained the same energy as the mightiest beings, that respecting life in all its forms was essential to truly understanding the Force. This perspective contrasted sharply with the sterile temple environment on Coruscant, where Jedi lived in constructed spaces separated from nature. Dagobah forced Yoda to reconnect with the living force in immediate, visceral ways, reinforcing lessons he'd always taught, but perhaps hadn't fully embodied until exile stripped away all distractions. The dark side cave on Dagobah became a testing ground Yoda used for Luke's training. The cave was strong in the dark side, filled with malevolent energy that created visions reflecting visitors' fears and inner darkness. Yoda sent Luke into the cave as part of his training, knowing the experience would force Luke to confront his own capacity for darkness, his fear about becoming like Vader. Luke's vision in the cave, where he fought and beheaded Vader only to see his own face in the helmet, showed him that the potential for evil existed within himself, that the line between Jedi and Sith was thinner than he'd believed. Yoda understood this lesson was crucial. Students who didn't recognize their own darkness were most vulnerable to it. Yoda's understanding of the dark side evolved significantly over his lifetime. In his youth and middle years, he viewed it primarily as evil to be resisted and destroyed, a corruption of the Force that needed to be eliminated. But his studies during exile, his conversations with Force spirits and the Force priestesses, taught him that the dark side was part of the Force's natural balance, that it represented passion, emotion, change, and chaos, as opposed to the light side's peace, knowledge, serenity, and harmony. The dark side wasn't evil inherently. It became evil when users gave themselves over to it completely, when they used passion and emotion destructively rather than channeling them constructively. This understanding didn't make Yoda sympathetic to the Sith or to dark side users who caused suffering. He still opposed them, still fought them when necessary, still believed the Jedi's purpose was defending light over darkness. But he recognized that the old Jedi Order's rigid suppression of all emotion and attachment had been a mistake, that denying the dark side's existence or trying to eliminate it entirely was impossible and counterproductive. True balance came from acknowledging both sides while choosing light, from feeling emotions while not being controlled by them, from forming attachments while not allowing attachment to drive you to evil actions when loved ones were threatened. These insights shaped what Yoda taught Luke, and through him influenced the new Jedi Order Luke eventually established. The new order didn't forbid attachment, didn't require students to sever all emotional connections. didn't insist on absolute detachment from the world. Instead, it taught balance, responsibility, using emotions as sources of strength rather than weaknesses to be suppressed. Luke himself married, had a son, formed deep friendships, all while remaining committed to the light side. The approach wasn't without risks. Attachment could still lead to darkness, as Ben Solo's fall demonstrated. But the old way had failed catastrophically, and Yoda's final teachings suggested a different path was worth attempting. Yoda's species and their connection to the Force remained mysterious even after his death. The species' extreme longevity suggested they experienced time fundamentally differently than shorter-lived beings. For Yoda, a year was a tiny fraction of his lifespan, barely noticeable in the grand sweep of his existence. This might explain his patience, his ability to wait decades for plans to develop, his perspective on events that seemed urgent to humans but were merely moments in his extended timeline. It might also explain his difficulties understanding beings whose entire lives passed in what seemed like an instant to him. The gap between his temporal experience and that of species who lived merely decades was vast, creating communication and understanding challenges. The mystery of Yoda's species served important narrative purposes. It made him fundamentally alien, a being whose nature couldn't be fully understood by projecting human psychology and motivations onto him. His wisdom came partly from an utterly different perspective on existence, from experiencing the galaxy in ways no human could comprehend. Keeping his species unnamed, his homeworld unknown, his background mysterious, preserved that alien quality. It prevented him from being reduced to simply a wise old human in a funny-looking body. He remained genuinely other, connected to the Force in ways that reflected his species' unique nature. After Yoda's death, his Force spirit continued, playing a role in galactic events. He appeared to Luke during crucial moments, providing guidance and wisdom from beyond death. His ability to manifest was limited. Force ghosts couldn't intervene directly in physical events, couldn't fight battles or prevent disasters. They could only observe, advise, and occasionally demonstrate Force abilities that affected the physical world in minor ways. But their knowledge and perspective were invaluable, providing continuity between the old Jedi Order and the new, ensuring hard-won wisdom wasn't lost when physical bodies died. Yoda's Force ghost appeared during Luke's crisis of faith after Ben Solo's fall to the dark side. Luke had gone into exile on Ahch-To, the planet where the first Jedi temple had been built, intending to die there and let the Jedi end with him. He believed the Jedi Order caused more harm than good, that their failures had enabled both Vader's rise and Kylo Ren's fall, that the galaxy would be better off without them. Yoda appeared to him there, manifesting with the same humor and wisdom he'd shown in life. The ancient master used Force lightning to destroy the ancient Jedi texts Luke had been preserving, shocking Luke and making a crucial point. The books weren't important. The knowledge they contained mattered only if someone learned from it, applied it, grew from it. Failure was the greatest teacher. Yoda explained. Luke had failed Ben Solo, yes, but that failure could teach him how to succeed with future students if he didn't give up. The conversation between Luke and Yoda's ghost revealed how much Yoda had grown even after death. He acknowledged the old Jedi Order's failures more openly than he had in life, admitted that their rigidity and dogmatism had contributed to their extinction, accepted that Luke's instinct to create something different was correct, even if the execution had flaws. Yoda emphasized that the burden of all your students you must not carry, that each student made their own choices, that teachers could guide but not control, that failure was part of growth for both teacher and student. The wisdom came from 900 years of life and decades of reflection after death, distilled into lessons that could help Luke move forward rather than remaining paralyzed by guilt. Yoda's influence on Rey, the final protagonist of the Skywalker saga, was indirect, but significant. Rey studied the ancient Jedi texts that Yoda had pretended to destroy, but that had actually been saved by Rey herself before the tree burned. She learned from knowledge Yoda had preserved, studied techniques he'd mastered, built her understanding of the Force on foundations he'd established. When she faced the resurrected Palpatine, when she channeled the power of all past Jedi to defeat the Sith Lord permanently, Yoda's voice was among those strengthening her, his wisdom part of the collective knowledge that enabled her victory. The ultimate defeat of the Sith, the final fulfillment of the prophecy about bringing balance to the Force, came through a chain of teaching and learning that Yoda had anchored for centuries. The physical remnants of Yoda's life became objects of interest and reverence after his death. His lightsaber was lost during the Jedi Purge, likely destroyed or hidden when he went into exile. His hut on Dagobah remained for decades, slowly being reclaimed by the swamp, but still recognizable to anyone who found it. Luke visited the location multiple times, using it as a meditation site, as a place to feel close to his master's memory. The hut was simple, constructed from natural materials, containing only the barest necessities for survival. It reflected Yoda's philosophy that Jedi didn't need material possessions, that connection to the Force and to life itself was sufficient. Yoda's teachings were recorded and preserved in various forms throughout his lifetime. He'd given lectures at the temple that were transcribed, had written texts on Jedi philosophy and Force techniques, had allowed his training sessions with younglings to be documented for future teachers. These materials became precious after the Purge, rare surviving records of Jedi knowledge that had been systematically destroyed by the Empire. Luke gathered what he could find, using them to reconstruct Jedi teachings when establishing his academy. Later historians and Force scholars studied these texts extensively, analyzing Yoda's philosophy, comparing his early and late teachings to understand how his thinking evolved, using his wisdom as a foundation for understanding the Force. The impact of Yoda's longevity on his teaching style deserves special attention. Because he lived so long, because he taught for 800 years, Yoda developed extraordinary patience and a deep understanding of how different individuals learned. He'd trained students from hundreds of species, each with unique physiology, psychology, and learning styles. He'd adapted his methods countless times, refined techniques based on which approaches worked best for which types of students. This accumulated pedagogical wisdom made him arguably the greatest teacher the Jedi Order ever produced, someone who could reach almost any student if given sufficient time and opportunity. But his longevity also created blind spots. Yoda had difficulty understanding urgency from shorter-lived species' perspectives, had trouble grasping why beings who lived merely decades felt such intense pressure about time. What seemed like reasonable patience to him felt like intolerable delay to humans and other short-lived species. This contributed to the Jedi Council's slow response to various crises, their tendency to study problems extensively before acting, their preference for long-term solutions over quick interventions. Yoda's perspective was valuable for seeing patterns across centuries, but it sometimes prevented necessary immediate action. Yoda's relationship with the clone troopers revealed interesting aspects of his character. He respected the clones as individuals, recognized their humanity despite their artificial creation, valued their service and sacrifice. He fought alongside them in numerous battles, coordinated with clone commanders, mourned clone casualties, but he also struggled with the ethical implications of using a slave army, of beings created specifically to fight and die for the Republic. The clones had no choice about their existence, no alternative to military service, no future beyond war. Yoda found this troubling, but accepted it as necessary for defending the Republic against separatist aggression. The compromise haunted him, represented one more way the Jedi had bent their principles to serve political necessities. When the clones executed Order 66, Yoda felt betrayed but also understood. The clones hadn't chosen to betray the Jedi. They'd been programmed from creation to follow orders, and Order 66 was just another order, no different in their minds than any other directive they'd received. The real betrayal came from the Kaminoans, who'd built the contingency orders into the clones, from Palpatine, who'd orchestrated the clones' creation specifically to serve as instruments of the Jedi's destruction, from the Republic that had accepted a slave army without question. Yoda's anger and grief were directed appropriately, recognizing the clones as victims like the Jedi themselves, pawns in a Sith scheme decades in the making. Yoda's greatest strength was arguably his deep connection to the Force itself. He didn't just use the Force as a tool, he existed in partnership with it, allowing the Force to flow through him and guide him in ways that few Jedi achieved. This connection gave him extraordinary abilities, allowed him to perform feats that seemed impossible, granted him wisdom beyond what experience alone could provide. But it also made him dependent on that connection, vulnerable when the dark side clouded his perceptions. During the Clone Wars, when Sidious's machinations created disturbances in the Force, Yoda found his abilities diminished, his clarity compromised. The experience was deeply unsettling, like losing a sense he'd relied on for centuries. His ability to sense individuals through the Force was legendary. Yoda could identify Jedi across the galaxy, could feel their emotional states, could know when they were in danger or had died. This ability made Order 66 particularly traumatic. He felt thousands of Jedi dying simultaneously, experienced their pain and fear and confusion as they were murdered by troops they'd trusted. The psychic shock was overwhelming, a wound that never fully healed even decades later. Every Jedi he'd trained, every student he'd guided, every colleague he'd worked with, their deaths were personal losses, multiplied thousands of times over in a matter of hours. Yoda's fighting style in his later years, particularly during his duel with Sidious, demonstrated how he'd adapted to aging even within his species' extended lifespan. At 900 years old, Yoda was at the very end of his natural life. His movements were slower than in his prime, his stamina reduced, his physical abilities diminished. But he compensated through even deeper connection to the Force, through centuries of accumulated technique and wisdom, through perfect efficiency of movement that eliminated all wasted energy. He couldn't fight as long as he once could, but while he fought, he was still devastatingly effective. The duel with Sidious proved that even at 900 years old, Yoda remained one of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy. His decision to go into exile rather than continuing to resist the Empire was pragmatic, but also deeply painful. Yoda was not a coward. He'd fought in countless battles, had faced death numerous times, would have gladly sacrificed himself if it would have accomplished anything meaningful. But after failing to kill Sidious, after recognizing that the Sith had won completely, that the Empire was consolidated and the Jedi were extinct, continuing to fight would have been suicide without purpose. Better to survive, to preserve knowledge, to wait for the Force to create new opportunities. The decision required accepting defeat, acknowledging that despite 900 years of life and immense power, he'd failed in the most important task entrusted to him. That acceptance took more courage than continuing a doomed resistance would have required. During his exile on Dagobah, Yoda maintained a daily routine that balanced meditation, physical activity, and connection to the Force. He would wake with the swamp's native creatures, would gather food from plants and fungi he'd identified as safe, would exercise to maintain what physical capabilities remained at his advanced age. Most importantly, he meditated for hours daily, reaching into the Force, communing with Qui-Gon's spirit, studying with the Force priestesses, deepening his understanding of concepts he'd taken for granted during his centuries of service. The exile was transformative, stripping away everything except his connection to the Force, forcing him to rediscover fundamental truths he'd lost sight of amid institutional responsibilities. Yoda's final gift to the galaxy was Luke Skywalker, trained and prepared to the best of Yoda's ability, despite limited time and challenging circumstances. Luke wasn't the perfect Jedi the Old Order would have created. He was too emotional, too attached to his friends and family, too willing to take risks and trust his feelings over traditional Jedi discipline. But those qualities, the very traits the Old Order would have tried to suppress, were what allowed Luke to succeed where the old Jedi had failed. Luke's love for his father redeemed Anakin and destroyed the Sith. His emotional connections gave him strength rather than weakness. His willingness to trust his feelings led him to make the right choice when facing the Emperor. Yoda recognized before his death that Luke represented something different from what the Jedi Order had been, that this was necessary and good, that the Force was showing them a new path forward. His final words to Luke, "Always pass on what you have learned," were an invitation to do exactly that. Luke should teach what Yoda had taught him, yes, but he should also learn from his own experiences, adapt the teachings based on what worked and what didn't, create something new rather than simply recreating what had existed before. The permission to innovate, to build on tradition rather than being bound by it, was perhaps Yoda's most important final lesson. The legacy of Yoda extends far beyond the events depicted in the films. He represents an ideal of what the Jedi could be at their best. Wise without arrogance, powerful without aggression, committed to justice without becoming rigid, understanding failure as part of growth rather than something to be avoided at all costs. His life demonstrated that wisdom came from experience, including painful experience, that the greatest teachers were those who'd made mistakes and learned from them, that power meant nothing without the wisdom to use it appropriately. For students of the Force across generations, Yoda became the standard by which other masters were measured. When evaluating a teacher's philosophy or a training technique's effectiveness, the question was always, what would Yoda have done? How would he have approached this situation? What wisdom would he have shared? His teachings were studied, analyzed, debated, applied to new situations he never encountered. His distinctive voice was imitated, his speech patterns copied, his mannerisms adopted by students trying to channel even a fraction of his wisdom and power. But perhaps Yoda's most important contribution was demonstrating that size, appearance, physical strength, all the qualities beings typically associate with power, mattered far less than character, wisdom, and connection to the Force. He was small, ancient, seemingly frail, the opposite of what most species considered impressive or formidable. Yet he was one of the most powerful beings in galactic history, proof that the Force was available to anyone regardless of physical form. That true strength came from within rather than from external attributes. This lesson resonated across species and cultures, inspiring beings who might otherwise have believed they were too small, too weak, too different to matter. Standing before Yoda's legacy, examining his 900 years of life from mysterious birth through legendary career to exile and final transcendence, we see a being who embodied the best of what the Jedi represented, while also demonstrating their limitations and failures. He was neither perfect nor invincible, neither omniscient nor infallible. He was a teacher who tried his best with the knowledge he had, who failed catastrophically, yet learned from failure, who adapted and grew even at 900 years old, who understood that passing on wisdom was more important than clinging to life. His story reminds us that true wisdom includes recognizing what we don't know, that the greatest strength often comes wrapped in the most unlikely packages, and that the Force, the energy binding all things together, works through beings willing to serve something larger than themselves. Thank you for exploring the complete lore of Yoda with me. If you enjoyed this deep examination into one of Star Wars' most iconic and wise characters, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more comprehensive explorations of the characters, locations, and events that shape the galaxy far, far away. May the Force be with you, always.